Great. Thank you very much, Fred. And thanks for joining me in my talk about managing the risk of product innovation. Don't call it fate and make the unconscious conscious. What I want to talk today about is taking another lens at innovation. I would like to take the risk lens to innovation. And why do I want to do that? Well, if you look in general, innovation is risky. Innovation is a bet on the future. It is a lot about uncertainty. And if you look at some statistics, between 70 and 90% of all new products fail. Or if you look at startups, almost 2/3 of all startup investments lose money. So there are a lot of losses involved, making it really something risky. And just take one example. There was last year this company called Quibi. Quibi was a short form streaming platform. They created content for viewing on your mobile. So the idea was you would be watching special formats on your mobile while commuting to work. The service had great management team. They launched in April 2020. At the beginning of the pandemic, already in October 2020, they announced that they would shut down the service in December. This company, Quibi, had raised $1.75 billion from investors. So there is really a lot of risk involved. And when preparing for this talk, I suddenly got this song in my mind from U2, With or Without You, I Can't Live With or Without You. Well, from my point of view, not really. But if you look at some other statistics, for example, this Gartner report, almost 50% of the participants said that organizational resistance to risk is a barrier for innovation, making it the number one barrier for innovation in the study. Looking at the other side, innovation is driving growth. According to PwC, innovative companies grow 16% faster than non-innovative companies. And you can also take a lifetime perspective on companies, where innovation is important for making companies future-proof. So this study said that the company lifetime reduced the last 50 years by almost 50%, from the 1970s to the 2020s. So that made me think, how can we bring this together? Innovation being risky, innovation being blocked by the organizational resistance to risk, but also innovation being necessary for the growth and the survival of companies. And from my point of view, we need to address it more explicit. We need to really look at it. We need to look clearly at uncertainty and risk and make it conscious. And there I got this quote from Carl Gustav Jung saying, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So starting first of all, what is actually risk? Well, risk is a state of uncertainty where some possibilities involve a loss, a catastrophe, or other undesirable outcomes. So it is closely linked to uncertainty. And when you think about uncertainty, you come to the point that not all innovation are equal. There are innovation which are close to the current business, to the core that you're currently doing. There you have far less uncertainty because you have a lot of knowledge. You know about the market, you know about the customers, you know about the technology that you need. Think about a company making, for example, pudding. Well, just to add a new pudding with a different flavor is not really a lot of uncertainty because you know it. You know the majority of things. If you think about innovation that are creating totally new opportunities, totally new business models, transformative innovation, where you're opening something completely new. Well, you know nothing about the customers, you know nothing about the market, the technology perhaps. So there is a lot of uncertainty here involved with it. For this pudding example, for example, if they would suddenly start thinking about making cereals, there is far more uncertainty involved. When talking about risk management for innovation, let me first of all get one thing also pretty clear. This is today not about disencouraging anybody doing innovation. It's not about over-analyzing why things are not going to work. So it's not about we can't do that because. Instead, I would like to take a perspective that says we can do that by. It's about creating transparency and clarity about potential sources of failure, analyzing and evaluating them, and finding ways to reduce uncertainty and mitigate risk. For doing so, we need to give management tools and methods for reducing uncertainty about their decisions so that they can make, instead of gut-based decisions, they make informed and evidence-based decisions. And for doing so, we somehow need to manage and measure uncertainty and innovation. And that does not necessarily require sophisticated methods. When you know almost nothing, every little piece of information will already help you a lot. Some might say now, well, innovation risk management, that will slow down innovation. Well, my experience is that the topic of risk will sooner or later pop up on your innovation journey anyhow. Therefore, approach it proactively. And with this quote by Carl Gustav Jung, there is another point that we need to keep in mind. Everybody has a different risk perception and tolerance. So that creates your kind of personal and unique risk fingerprint. When you think now about a company, you have different people involved on your innovation journey, and they all have their unique risk fingerprints. So to bring them together, you need to make uncertainty and risk conscious, make it transparent for everybody so that you can relate to the ways others experience risk to really move things forward. To start, I had been looking at a lot of case studies of product failures, startup failures, looking at statistics. And for me, it condensed to 6 dimensions looking at risk. It starts from the non-viability of the product, over bad timing, unintended consequences, flaws in the organization and strategic flaws, and also looking at your risk and reporting system. So let's go through them one by one. If you talk about the non-viability of your product innovation, I like to start always with this IDEO sweet spot for innovation, where you look at the desirability, the feasibility, and the viability. So the question, do our customers really want it? Can we make it? And should we make it? And one of the most critical points is really that in many cases, companies build something that nobody wants. That often happens because they are not clear about who they really build it for. They are not clear about who their customers are. So they can also not speak with them. Instead, they are dreaming in thought, they are in their office thinking about what the potential customers might want, but not really speaking with them, really discovering the problems that we want to solve with this product innovation. You could also think about regulatory or legal challenges. Think, for example, about Uber. Uber still is not able to fully start in Germany because of regulatory issues, slowing them down. Next, we can look at the timing, and there I would like to start with a study by Bill Gross. Bill Gross, the founder of the startup accelerator Idea Lab. And he had been looking at the startup successes and failures that he had there in his accelerator. And he had been looking for the biggest predictor of startup success, and it was timing. So you need to be really at the right time on the market. There are examples for being too early, like for example, the Apple PDA Newton, which was ahead of its time. It wasn't technology-wise not really ready. The total infrastructure was not ready. So it was a costly toy that could not do much more than a cheap notepad. And there are examples for innovation being too late, like Kodak, Nokia, BlackBerry. It is not that they hadn't been working on the solutions. Kodak invented the digital camera, but they didn't bring it to the market. That led to their disruption. Look at Nokia and BlackBerry. Also, they had been working on something comparable like a smartphone, but they were too late bringing it to the market. And you could also think about prematurely scaling. So when you're in your innovation process and you haven't reached product market fit yet, but decide to already scale, that can also lead to the failure of your innovation and also to a lot of cost. While these first 2 points were more looking at the risk for the company because they are making a loss, the unintended consequences look more on the effects on people and, for example, environment. The unintended consequences happen when the innovation brings something that the company hadn't been thinking about, that hadn't been planned, that was totally unintended. Let's take 2 examples. It can depend on the choices people make when using your product. Think about the Tesla autopilot. It has not been intended for people to read newspapers not sitting on the driver's seat. It was intended to support drivers and, of course, the way to autonomous driving. But definitely you shouldn't be reading newspapers. Or think about electrical scooters. They had been intended for short distance commuting. Definitely not for vandalism or being thrown into rivers. Another point, the unintended consequences can also depend on the current knowledge and the current infrastructure that you have. Think, for example, about plastic pollution. I was co-hosting a conference for teenagers last year, and we had a guest keynote speaker coming from an NGO fighting plastic pollution. And he was asked by the teenagers, why didn't you do anything against plastic before? Why did you all of this let happen? Why was plastic so widespread? And he had to admit, we didn't know. When plastic came on the market, it was convenient for all of us. It made our lives so much easier. We were not aware of the consequences that it brings to the environment. Next, let's look at the organizational flows. And definitely this list is far from being complete, but you can think, for example, about the difficulty companies face when handling the running current business on the one hand, and at the same time developing new businesses. Some companies want to solve it, for example, by putting innovation in a separate unit, a separate department. That might be helpful. The innovation process might be really fast, but sooner or later, this innovation needs to be brought on the market. There, the running business might work against you because it might even be cannibalizing their business. So you need to also have a look at these organizational relations. Look at topics like the hippo phenomenon of past success. Yesterday we had a talk where somebody had been looking really in detail at Amazon and the Amazon Fire Phone, which Jeff Bezos really was leading. So they did everything that Jeff Bezos wanted, not really talking with customers. But past success is definitely no predictor of future success. Or you can look at the innovation team. Who is on your team? Do you have any blind spots because you lack diversity in your team? Or if you're working on transformative innovation with a lot of uncertainty, how comfortable are the people on your team with uncertainty? Then you can think about the innovation culture. How does the company react on failure? What's the attitude towards failure? Think about psychological safety. How freely are you to speak and open up? And last but not least, the engagement of the top management. Innovation, especially transformative innovation, will not work when you don't have the full support of the top management. So these are all topics that are related to the organization that can really cause a risk for the company. Let's look at the strategic flows next. It starts with that you need to have a framework for your innovation. You need to know the direction, the topics that you want to work on, the topics that you want to invest time, money, and other resources in. And that is defined in an innovation strategy. So, for example, if you don't have an innovation strategy, it is difficult to judge where you're really going, if it's the right direction. Think about a portfolio where you have all your innovation projects. Have a look, is it balanced? Are you only investing in innovation that is close to your core? Well, that might lead to a big risk. When your core business gets disrupted, you have nothing to cover that for. On the other hand, if you're only investing in new business but no longer in your core, you're running the risk that your solution that was very desired in the past might no longer be desired. So you really need to look at how you allocate your resources and how you manage your portfolio of the different innovation projects, that it's really balanced with core and really developing new business opportunities. And last but not least, the risk and reporting system itself can be a factor of risk. It starts with something like information or cognitive overload, that it's simply too many information. And the administrative overload, on the other hand, forcing the innovation team to create a lot of metrics, taking them away from doing their real work. So that also needs to be balanced by focusing really on those metrics that really move the needle. Then you can, for example, look at where your data is coming from. If, for example, you just take financial data, you need to be aware that financial data is always data from the past. It's like driving in a car forward by looking in the rearview mirror. You're just taking things that have already happened. But for many innovation projects, for a long time, that's only cost. So you need to think about other metrics that help you track the progress and give you information about the potential success of your innovation project. And then you need to look at the metrics. A wrong metric can lead you to addressing the wrong problems and making wrong decisions. Let's look, for example, at ROI, the return on investment. The return on investment favors those ideas that are using existing equipment because you don't need to do so many investments. That means it favors product ideas that are closer to the core, but definitely not transformative innovation. And then you also could look with what do you compare your metrics? If you compare your just started product innovation with a solution that is already long-term on the market, you're comparing two products that are at different levels of the growth cycle. Also that leading to wrong decisions. So now, having looked at 6 dimensions for innovation risk, let's look at a few tools how you can manage innovation risk. And I would like to start with a very general risk tool that is a risk matrix. We will go deeper and look at an experiment canvas. We look at some innovation and risk matrix and would close this with looking at how you can really use financial models to create transparency of the chances and risk of your innovation project. So if you look at a risk matrix, and a risk matrix that is not really specific for innovation. It is one of the most widely used tools for risk management. What you can do, you map all your risk on 2 dimensions. You can map it horizontally on the likelihood that this risk will really happen. And you could have 5 categories from very unlikely to very likely. And then on the vertical axis, you put the impact. Again, 5 categories from negligible to disastrous if this risk really happens. And then you can map your risk. For example, we have risk A, which is very likely and it will cause a disaster. Well, these are really the risks you need to have a closer look at. These are the ones that you need to manage. While, for example, risk D, it's negligible, it's very unlikely. So that is the one that you should definitely not start focusing on. Why I show this tool here is because I think it's a really good starting point into managing innovation risk. It helps you creating clarity. It is simple to use, it's simple to communicate, but you need to keep in mind that it's qualitative. Especially it is difficult to understand the differences between likely, very likely, especially when you're doing it in a group. Everybody can have a different perspective what likely and very likely means. So let's go one step further and look at the experiment canvas. The experiment canvas is a tool that you can use to track the progress that you make when testing your assumptions. Assumptions are those things where you don't have knowledge about your innovation idea, but assumptions. You assume certain things. You assume things that need to be correct for your innovation project to be a success. And there have been already some talks about how to come up with assumptions. Also after this talk, Alex will talk about assumptions mapping, so I will not go too deep onto this. But in this experiment canvas, you capture the assumptions that you have discovered before, and you make it very clear, okay, which customer, which user group do we want to test now our assumption on? You create a hypothesis in which you really express your assumption with numbers. And I'm a big favor of the XYZ hypothesis by Alberto Savoia because it's really so strict, and he defines it by saying at least X% of Y, that is your target market, will do Z, and that is the expected behavior of your target group. So you put the hypothesis in this experiment canvas, then you describe the experiment that you do. Important is the next step. You really time box your experiments. You clearly define how long it will take to do this experiment, and you also get a dedicated budget for doing this experiment. By this, you really mitigate risk, because if the experiment shows you that the idea is most probably going to fail, you only lost the money that you have spent on this experiment. In many companies, it's the case that an innovation idea gets already fully funded upfront. Here we really have something called metered funding, where you only get so much money to make your next experiments, really reducing the uncertainty. Then you put in here the results, your learnings, and then you come to a decision. How to go forward? Can we take this innovation idea forward? Did our experiment show that we're still on a good track? Should we pivot? What do we have to change something? Or did the data show that this innovation idea most probably is going to fail? If this is the case, we should think about a disengagement plan that should really try to damage control in the company. There will be stakeholders that will be disappointed that the experiment showed that this idea most probably is going to fail. So you need to think about how to handle these stakeholders. And you need to think about, okay, what learnings can we take from this experiment? And let's take the example of the Fire Phone again. Amazon learned a lot from the failure of the Fire Phone. One of the learnings is Alexa, which has initially been intended for the Fire Phone and later became one of the most distributed voice systems, for example, in the Amazon speakers. That is how Amazon took some learnings out of it. Let's look at some risk metrics, and I would like to start with a pretty simple one, also related to the assumptions. That's the assumptions to knowledge ratio. So you count the number of assumptions that you have and put them in relation to the knowledge that you have. How does that help? Well, first of all, it gives you an indication about the uncertainty that you have. So the higher the assumptions to knowledge ratio, the more uncertainty you have in your innovation idea. In addition, you can use this metric to track the progress. Your objective is to step by step reduce the assumptions to knowledge ratio so you can track the progress that you're making with your experiments. Another metric that shows you how fast you progress is, for example, the experiment velocity, showing you the number of experiments that you are doing in a certain period of time. But you could also look at the learning velocity, because experiment velocity can be gained when an innovation team only focuses on small and fast experiments that are not really help you progress with learnings. It might be better looking really at the learning velocity. The next two metrics are looking at the portfolio, which I already mentioned before. So the portfolio distribution looks at the number of innovation projects that you have per innovation category. For example, how many projects do you have running around your core? That would be the core innovation. How many transformational innovations do you have running? And perhaps adjacent. Looking really how well balanced your portfolio is. Closely related to this is the investment distribution, where you look how many resources you put into each of these innovation categories. And a final metric, for example, could be looking at the top management engagement. How much priority does the top management give to innovation? You could look at how much time do they spend on innovation. What is the importance of innovation in important management meetings? Or you could look at the speed of decision making. Just imagine this. You have a high learning and experiment velocity coming really with good results, and then you wait for weeks for a decision, slowing your innovation project down. A fourth tool is looking at financial models and simulations. When you start with an innovation project, usually people ask you, make a business plan before. So you sit down days, weeks, perhaps even months, writing down a business plan. The more detailed, the better. Well, the idea behind it is that you want to manage uncertainty by very detailed and sophisticated planning. But usually after a couple of weeks in reality, this will no longer work. So what I will propose here is a different procedure by really calculating the expected outcome of an innovation idea already in early phases, but with far less work and on a far more simple level. How do you do that? Well, you start with the idea, then you start framing the idea, for example, by using a business model canvas, a lean canvas, a value proposition, really becoming clear, okay, who are our target customers? What is the value proposition we want to bring to them? What are the channels we want to reach our customers? How do we want to generate revenue? That is what you're framing, a first idea how that could look like. And then you look at the customer journey. So how is your customer becoming aware of your solution, going through this funnel until he finally brings you revenue? Already in these 3 steps, you help making underlying assumptions transparent. In the next step, when looking at the financial model, where you really take all of these so far still qualitative data and you put it in numbers. But what we are doing here, not like in a business plan, we explicitly incorporate uncertainty. And how do we do that? Well, we are not working with fixed values like in a business plan, but we are working with ranges. What do I mean with ranges? If I would ask you, what is the height of the Eiffel Tower? I would guess majority of you don't know. But if I would ask you, well, what do you guess is the range that covers the Eiffel Tower? So what do you think would be a minimum height or a maximum height? What do you think would be a range? And you say, well, the Eiffel Tower is definitely higher than the house that I'm living in, and it's definitely not the tallest building in the world. So let's say I'm pretty sure it's between 50 and 500 meters high. That's what I mean with ranges. And that's exactly correct, because the Eiffel Tower is 324 meters high. And we're taking these ranges now to run Monte Carlo simulations. Monte Carlo is a method from stochastics where you calculate possible results of uncertain input factors. And like I said, we will not use fixed values for the input factors, but we are using the ranges. And for these ranges, we calculate random numbers. And we're not only running this once, but we can run it multiple times, 10,000 times, 10,000 times. And then we have 1,000, 10,000 results. And that can help us using statistical methods to really analyze the data that we have created here. We can, for example, look at the likelihood of a certain target outcome. We can look at the probability distributions of our outcomes. And we can also run sensitivity analysis. We can look what are really the critical phases and assumptions in this model that are making the outcome better or worse. By this, we can really identify the critical assumptions of the model and focus our next steps on them. In addition, and that's what I really like about this, we really work with numbers and we create internal alignment about numbers, not like in the risk matrix where you might have a different perception what is likely and what is very likely. You're really talking about numbers. And surprisingly, this talk about numbers can even spark creative discussions. One other point, we can use this model also to track the progress of our product innovation. So in addition to the experiment canvas, we can also use this model in which we put the results of our experiments. For example, if we thought about an input factor in the beginning, that it would perhaps be between 10 and 20%. And based on our experiments, we then find out, well, it's between 15 and 20%. Then we can analyze how this changes the expected outcome. And by this, we can make informed and evidence-based decisions. So how could such a model look like? And this is really a pretty simple model based on the pirate metrics, where you look at the acquisition, the activation, how you generate revenue with your customer, the retention, that your customer stays your customer, and the referral. I put these numbers here in the middle where you see the parameters. And what we are doing now is, instead of saying, well, the fixed value for the acquisition is something like 800, we define a range with a lower limit and an upper limit, being in this case between 600 and 1000. The same for the activation, between 10 and 15%, on looking at the monthly revenues, etc., etc. So after defining these ranges, we start calculating random numbers in a financial simulation. So if we look at the top part there and start with the month of April, there we see, look, we have visitors coming to our website, for example, that is coming from the acquisition. And we have here a random number being created out of this range, 600 till 1000. And in this run, it was 752. From these 752 visitors, 94 become customers. That is being calculated via a random number for the activation coming from the range that we have defined. So that at the end of August, we would have 94 customers. Then we're moving into the next month, into September. Again, 752 people are coming on our website. We have 4 referred customers coming from the customers of August via a random number for the referral rate, leading to that we have 94 new customers, but we also lost some customers of the previous period. We were able to remain 48, so that at the end we have 142 customers at the end of September. And that is going to be continued over 3 years in this model. This is just one simulation. It's going to get interesting when you run it multiple times, like let's say 10,000 times. Then you can look, for example, at numbers as we see them here at the bottom, where you really analyze the likelihood of target outcomes that you want to achieve. Let's say you want to have a target outcome of 100,000 euro in the first year, 150,000 in the second, and 250 in the third year, totaling to 500,000 euro. Well, based on the 10,000 simulations that we have been running with different random numbers, we come to the point that the likelihood of generating 100,000 in the first year is pretty good. That's 90%. But it drops already in the second year, where we wanted to make 150,000, while the likelihood is only 53% now. And especially in the third year, we're getting into trouble. We wanted to make 250,000. Well, the likelihood is only 3%. So the total chance that we are really reaching our target of 500,000 is only 33%. We could go deeper into the details. We could look at the probability distribution. We could look at the likelihood of worst case, best case scenarios. We could look at the sensitivity of this parameter. What is really driving growth? Is it retention? Is it referral? Is it the monthly usage fee? That is all possible via these Monte Carlo simulations. Well, some concluding thoughts. First of all, and that's how I started, innovation is risky, but definitely don't let the fear of losses slow down your innovation endeavors. Instead, start measuring uncertainty, measure innovation, measure risk, and by this creating internal alignment. Think about making the assumptions transparent. This will help you move forward in the team. And then you manage your innovation process via looking at the assumptions, via time boxing and metered funding. You can use financial models to simulate the expected outcomes, and you can really run deep statistical analysis. And as with your product innovation, you're not done with your first shot. Instead, really go and iterate. Start small and then start iterating and making your risk management and your metrics become better and better until they are hopefully one day great. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Marcus. I have one question for you. What role do projects have?
Well, for me, the project is how you drive your innovation ideas forward. So you somehow need to frame it in a kind of a project with a certain scope and then really driving it forward.
Okay. Thank you. Another question I've got now. If you have no framework tool at the moment, where do you start?
Well, I would start really small. And from my point of view, there are lots of entrance points, of course, always depending on where you're standing. For me, it is already helpful being aware that you have a fantastic idea. You really think it's the best, it will disrupt the market, you will create a unicorn, all of this. But if you look at the data, the probability that you are going to fail is pretty high. So I think it's already important that you are aware and really take steps forward. From my point of view, assumptions mapping, a risk matrix can already help. I also made really good experience with really looking at financial models for one simple reason. There are people really hesitant to start with working on financial models and think it's going to be difficult. In the end, if you created one or two models, it is pretty simple. It only takes you a few hours. If you compare that to the time you spend on creating a business plan, it really saves you a lot of time. And sooner or later, you need to provide these financial data. I have been working on a project in my past, on an IoT project, and the big mistake in this project was that nobody really wanted to commit on certain financial results. It was like, no, it's a strategic project. As long as you bring it to the market on time, that's good. Unfortunately, before rolling out, I got the information, well, we don't have a market budget for you. It was always said, well, you get it, but at that point it was, no marketing budget for you. And it put me in a really difficult situation because I had nothing at hand at that point of really showing what this innovation could bring so that I argue based on quantitative data. So I would really encourage you also having a look at simple tools to express uncertainty on a quantitative level.
Okay, thank you. Another questions. How do you bring your team on that journey? Like, let's say you're passionate, you want to start. How do you bring other people on that journey with you? Because alone, I don't think it's going to be difficult. So, how do you bring other people on that journey?
No, for sure, it's not a single person's job. So it's really a team job. From my point of view, one of the really most important topics is getting clarity, first of all, what are assumptions? I think there was already a great talk about assumptions yesterday in the lean experimentation. Alex is later talking about assumptions mapping. For me, really creating clarity on the assumptions. So what needs to be true for our idea to succeed is the most important starting point. And it's also the point where you realize in a team that you have different ideas about what needs to be true. Also, when you look at the financial model, it becomes transparent that people have different perspectives, what is going to be needed. So I would really start with the assumptions to bring the team on the journey, because that creates the most clarity that you need to go deeper into this topic.
Thank you, Marcus. I think we have time for one last question. Could you recommend any books to learn more about assessing managing risk of product innovation?
Yes. Well, for me, there are 3 or 4 books which I would recommend looking at. It starts with Douglas Hubbard, who has written 2 great books. One is How to Measure Anything, and he has also been writing a book about the failure of risk management. He's really going very deep, especially on being quantitative and also going deep on Monte Carlo simulations. When you want to look at measuring innovation, I would recommend looking at Dan Tomer and Esther Gon's Innovation Accounting, which is going far more into details. I mean, innovation accounting was coined by Eric Ries in the Lean Startup, but Dan Tomer and Esther Gon, they really take it much, much deeper and really come with a lot of metrics that are really helpful. And then I would look at Michel Wuka. You Are What You Risk, really taking this individual perspective, the risk tolerance, etc., much deeper, and also helping the understanding of risk also between people, thinking about risk empathy. So these would be the 3 or 4 books I would recommend.
Thank you, Marcus. I think we have no more questions. Thank you again for a great presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
And have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.